It was the way they moved, like smoke twisting in the wind, but silent. No footsteps, no rustle of leaves, just a gliding. And their eyes, oh those hollow, black pits staring straight into my soul. Tolu had been struggling to find work after finishing his studies. One evening, an old friend approached him with a strange job offer to guard an abandoned village deep in the forest. The pay was good and the hours were easy, midnight to dawn. Nobody would bother him there because everyone avoided the place. They said it was cursed. But Tolu didn't believe in curses. He needed the money, so he took the job. On his first night, he arrived at the crumbling gates of the village, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a machete. As he settled into the small hut that served as his post, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier here, like the weight of countless secrets pressing down on him. That first night, Tolu heard whispers coming from the forest. At first, he thought it might be the wind blowing through the trees, but the sound was too deliberate, almost rhythmic. It sounded like voices murmuring softly, calling out names he didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped outside the hut to investigate. With his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, he ventured closer to the edge of the forest. That's when he noticed the footprints, barefoot impressions in the soft dirt, leading away from the village toward the heart of the woods. They looked fresh, as if someone had walked there moments ago. But who would come out here at this hour? Tolu followed the trail cautiously, his heart pounding louder with every step. After about 20 minutes of walking, Tolu emerged into a large clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center stood an ancient stone altar covered in moss and carvings he couldn't decipher. Around the altar, the ground was smooth and packed down, as if people had danced there many times before. Then he saw them, the figures standing motionless under the silver glow. There were 6 of them, dressed in tattered white robes, their faces obscured by shadows. For a moment, Tolu froze, unsure whether to run or stay hidden. Before he could decide, one of the figures turned its head slowly, locking gazes with him. Its eyes weren't human, they were empty voids that seemed to suck all the light out of the world. As soon as their eyes met, the figure tilted its head slightly, as if beckoning him closer. Tolu wanted to flee, but his legs refused to move. Instead, he watched helplessly as the other figures began to sway gently, their movements fluid and hypnotic. Their arms stretched upward, reaching for the moon, while their feet barely touched the ground. It was mesmerizing yet terrifying, a dance unlike anything Tolu had ever seen. Slowly, the rhythm quickened, and the air around them grew colder. He realized then that these weren't ordinary people. These were spirits, bound to the earth by some ancient curse. And now, they knew he was watching. Without warning, the dancers stopped moving altogether. The clearing fell silent except for the faint rustling of leaves overhead. Then, one of the figures stepped forward, raising a hand toward Tolu. He instinctively backed away, tripping over a root and falling onto the ground. From where he lay, he saw the figure extend its arm further, pointing directly at him. Suddenly, the others joined in, forming a circle around the clearing. Their hollow eyes stared at him unblinkingly, demanding attention. Tolu felt a chill run down his spine as the lead figure gestured again, this time accompanied by a low hum that resonated in his chest. It was clear they wanted him to join them. Tolu scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through him. He didn't know how or why, but he understood that staying in the clearing meant certain doom. As quietly as possible, he backed away, keeping his eyes on the dancers. They didn't move, only watched him with those soulless eyes. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he turned and sprinted into the forest, branches whipping at his face and thorns tearing at his clothes. Behind him, he thought he heard a soft whispering sound, like leaves brushing against each other, but when he glanced back, the clearing was empty. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. By the time Tolu reached the village gates, his heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He collapsed against the wooden barrier, gasping for air. But even as he tried to calm himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following him. Every rustle of leaves made him jump, every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and he retreated to the hut, locking the door behind him. Yet sleep eluded him that night. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the dancers' hollow stares and felt their icy presence lingering in the darkness. The next morning, TOLU decided he'd had enough. He packed up his few belongings, determined to leave the cursed village forever. But before he could depart, an old woman appeared at the gate. She introduced herself as Mama Aisha, a local healer who lived nearby. Her weathered face bore deep lines, and her voice carried the weight of countless years. "You saw them," she said without preamble, her gaze piercing. "The Moonlight dancers." TOLU froze, unsure how to respond. How did she know? I don't understand, he stammered. Mama Aisha nodded knowingly. "They've chosen you now. You can't run from what they are." She explained that the dancers were spirits tied to the land, guardians of a forgotten ritual meant to honor the ancestors. Long ago, villagers used to appease them with offerings, but when the traditions faded, the spirits grew restless. Now, anyone who witnessed their dance became marked, a fate worse than death. Her words sent chills down TOLU's spine. "What do I have to do?" he asked desperately. "Stay away from the clearing," she warned. "And never look into their eyes again." Despite Mama Aisha's warning, TOLU couldn't shake the feeling that the dancers weren't done with him. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Shadows moved where there should be none, whispers echoed in his ears, and whenever he caught sight of his reflection, he swore his eyes looked different, darker, emptier. One night, while sitting by the fire outside the hut, he noticed something peculiar on his wrist. A faint mark, almost like a scar, had appeared overnight. It resembled a crescent moon surrounded by intricate patterns. Panic set in as he realized the significance of the mark. Mama Aisha had mentioned it, the sign of the dancer's claim. Desperate for answers, he returned to her home, only to find it abandoned. The herbs and charms she kept hanging around her doorway were gone, as if she'd vanished without a trace. Alone once more, TOLU knew he had to confront whatever awaited him in the clearing. Armed with nothing but determination and a flickering lantern, TOLU ventured back to the clearing. This time, the dancers were waiting for him. They stood in perfect silence, their white robes glowing faintly in the moonlight. As TOLU approached, the lead figure stepped forward, extending its hand toward him. In its palm rested a small, jagged stone carved with ancient symbols. "This is your burden now," a voice whispered in his mind, not from the dancer, but directly inside him. The voice was cold, ancient, and unyielding. TOLU hesitated, knowing instinctively that accepting the stone would seal his fate. But refusing meant facing their wrath, and he doubted he could survive another encounter. With trembling hands, he took the stone. Immediately, a wave of exhaustion washed over him, and the world spun out of focus. When he opened his eyes, he found himself standing alone in the clearing, the dancers nowhere to be seen. The stone pulsed faintly in his grip, a constant reminder of his new role. Days turned into weeks, and TOLU discovered the truth about the Moonlight dancers. They weren't malevolent beings, but protectors of balance between the living and the dead. By taking the stone, he had become their guardian, tasked with maintaining the rituals that kept them bound to the earth. At first, the responsibility terrified him, but gradually, he came to accept it. However, the cost of his choice became clear one fateful night. While performing the ritual under the full moon, TOLU caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby pool of water. His eyes were no longer human, they were hollow, black voids that mirrored the dancers. From that moment on, he understood he was one of them now, forever walking the line between worlds. As the story spread, locals began leaving offerings at the edge of the forest, hoping to appease the Moonlight dancers. And though TOLU rarely left the clearing, he sometimes watched from the shadows, ensuring the cycle continued. After all, some legacies aren't meant to end. The world is full of mysteries beyond human understanding. Ignoring or dismissing these forces can lead to unintended consequences. TOLU's initial skepticism nearly cost him everything.